Lemons, and what I used to do, you have in your invitation mention of the Bir Lemons Guide to the Arab Peace Initiative, which one of two books we put out. It's a virtual book. You can find it on the website and download it. When we put it out, it didn't seem terribly relevant, but I'm happy to say it's, once again, it is relevant, and I think anyone who decides that you need to fill some knowledge gaps about the Arab Peace Initiative, there's a lot of interesting material there. But that's the last I'm going to say about the peace process, if you like, or almost the last, because there's a lot more to Israel's interaction with the region than just the peace process, and this is true going back 65 years. And I'm going to talk about the interaction with the region, and particularly with the non-Arab or non-Muslim states and peoples of the region, and describe it as a grand strategy, which is without a doubt a controversial description. There's a lot of many controversial aspects in what I'm going to talk about, and of course I invite you to challenge them and to enrich my own knowledge. This story begins essentially in the mid-50s, when Israel has fought two wars, 48 and 56, with the Arabs, 56 just with the Egyptians. And it looks around and sees itself surrounded by a ring of hostile Arab states, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, Arab nationalism, nasty propaganda about throwing the Jews into the sea, and comes to the conclusion that it's going to have to find friends elsewhere in the region, and that this is a worthwhile effort. And so it looks to what, from an Israelocentric way of looking at the Middle East, putting ourselves in the middle, which we do on our maps, of course, is the periphery. And the periphery is geographic, the periphery is ethnic as well. And the key, and so there develops what was called in internal circles, what I learned, what was my daily bread in my years in military intelligence and the Mossad, was called the Periphery Doctrine. And the idea was we would hook up with Iran and Turkey, we would hook up with Ethiopia, for a brief while Sudan, the first 2 years of Sudanese independence. We would look also for allies among minorities in the Middle East, the Kurds, the Maronites. Here, parenthetically, it should be noted that a drive to find friends and allies among other minority peoples, not states, but peoples, goes back almost 100 years, to the days of the Yishuv, the Jewish Agency Political Department, looking north to the Maronites, to the Druze, and saying, well, you know, we're going to be dealing with Arab nationalism for a long while. Let's see if we can set up a buffer state here or a buffer state there. Nothing ever came of this until 1982, when a serious and totally abortive effort took place, and one which really in many ways signaled the end of the Periphery Doctrine. So we have countries, non-Arab countries, we have minorities, and we have, I would include also on the periphery of the Arab world, Morocco, Oman, with which we had clandestine relationships going back a long time. On the geographic periphery of the Arab world, they weren't involved in the actual conflict, and they had their own very good reasons to want to have contact with Israel. What did this achieve in retrospect? The alliance, the strongest alliance was the one called Trident with Iran and Turkey. Lasted essentially until the fall of the Shah, 79. With Turkey, there were ups and downs before that, and since then, depending how strong the army was vis-a-vis the politicians, because the army was our ally there. And this was a full-fledged intelligence alliance. Like everything else to do with the Periphery Doctrine, it wasn't written down. There's no NATO treaty. And even internally, in my work, there was never a policy document that you referred to. I've asked repeated heads of Mossad whom I've interviewed, well, when you took over, were you shown a briefing book? This is the Periphery Doctrine, this is how it works? No, it was all on the fly, it was all improvised, which is the way we usually did things for a long time in Israel, sometimes well and sometimes not so well. So what succeeded and what failed? Well, success, I would say, would be Trident, because it not only gave us intelligence of a mixed nature, it not only but it also interacted with other grand strategies that were concocted by Ben Gurion and his aides more or less at the same time. A link with a major power. So we were able to market these periphery connections to the United States as a contribution against Soviet incursion into the Middle East, against Arab radicalism, get some funding, and get some support. A second interaction was with the mass gathering of the exiles to give Israel demographic critical mass. Morocco was a key case in point, some 400,000 Moroccan Jews immigrating to Israel, but Iran also, and the Kurds, who were able to serve as a conduit for the flight of Iraqi Jews from Baghdad north and then into Iran. A second area of I would say, of success was simply the overall power and lack of isolation that periphery connections were able to project. Our Arab neighbors knew about it, and so they knew we had friends. And in the case, the most interesting case is Egypt, where the very fact that we were sitting in Ethiopia, or that we had a very small, very modest military aid program with the Southern Sudanese from 1968 to 72, when they achieved a period of autonomy with Numeri. The very fact that we were in these places, near the White Nile, near the Blue Nile, bothered the Egyptians to it extremely. You Israelis are going to mess with the Nile. You're going to find a way to divert the water and cut us off. These are, and from an engineering standpoint, from every standpoint, this was impossible. Nor did Israel ever toy with the notion. But it sent a message to Egypt: we're in your backyard. We're sitting on your on a major resource of yours. You have to take us more seriously. Iran and Morocco were also helpful in the initial breakthrough to peace with Egypt. Sadat sent his messages via King Hassan and the Shah: I want to talk peace. And the initial meetings between Moshe Dayan and Hassan Touhami took place in Morocco. So this was also a contribution to the periphery. Perhaps the greatest success of all was Yemen. An informal, unsanctioned British effort to help the royalists in Yemen against the Republicans in the Yemen Civil War in the mid-60s. We were recruited by the British, and again, the great power connection is key here, to parachute in supplies to the royalists, the beleaguered royalists in very high mountain passes. One of the SAS guys who was involved finally wrote a book about it, and names every name, including Israeli secret agents who went in to signal the Air Force where to drop the stuff. But in terms of cost-benefit, the cost was very little. These were all captured Egyptian arms from 2 wars. And the benefit was that we tied down part of the Egyptian army, demoralized it. And when we did get to the 67 war, 30,000 of Nasser's best troops were still in Yemen. And those who weren't had been in Yemen and had been demoralized by that as well. So these are instances of success. South Sudan and Kurdistan were successes because, again, we can't take credit for all of this, but these were investments made decades ago, and you now see these two peoples either autonomous / independent, as in Kurdistan, or independent, as in South Sudan. And because they're minorities whose calculations were not just based on realpolitik, they remember us, and they remember it well. But then you contrast this with the failures. And the biggest, the most spectacular one is another minority, the Maronites, with whom we launched a project in 1982, which went completely awry because there was no real basis of trust between the two sides, and all of Israel's calculations were wrong. But it's interesting to know the idea of Israel helping to set up a Maronite-dominated state in Lebanon goes back to the 20s and 30s. And you can find in the 50s and 60s, or the 50s, Ben-Gurion is sending notes to Sharet, let's do it. And Sharet replied, giving him all the reasons, excellent reasons, why it would be foolhardy. And this discussion going on until Ariel Sharon does it. And it ends up so abysmally that you have virtually no Israeli interest in helping minorities, other minorities, ever since. But I'll come back to that in a minute. The other spectacular failure was 1973, when we expected, without any real foundation, it turns out, but we expected our periphery friends to be more helpful when the Yom Kippur War began. And instead, the Shah led the oil embargo. The Kurds refused to make any kind of military movements that would tie down Iraqi units to keep them from coming to the Golan front. And we now know that Kissinger was telling Helms in Tehran to tell the Shah and the Kurds not to help us. Not to help us, okay? This goes along with withholding weapons shipments and so on and so forth. And finally, the Moroccans, who sent a division to the Golan front and then quietly told our man in Morocco, please don't hurt them. But this was seen as a kind of betrayal. So there are plenty of critics in Israel who say that, I think correctly, the Periphery Doctrine as a grand strategy had a mixed record. It ends late 77, early 82. The fall of the Shah, the fall of Haile Selassie, the breakthrough to peace with Egypt. Once you're talking to the Arab core, the periphery is far less important and should be far less important, and the adventure with the Maronites. And by this time, it's more or less over. And we enter a period of several decades in which we, beginning with the peace with Egypt, eventually find ourselves dialoguing more and more with a number of Arab countries. You have the first Gulf War leading to the Madrid Conference, leading to the multinationals, leading to no fewer than 7 Arab countries that have diplomatic legations in Israel. All of this rendering the periphery either irrelevant or embracing it. If you look at the Arab geographic periphery, Oman and Morocco, which are among the first to set up their own legations in Israel based on a long history of connections with Israel. And so you have a flowering which comes to its climax in the mid-90s, and then it begins to subside as the peace process subsides. I'm not getting into who's to blame for that, and obviously Israel is partly to blame for that. The failure of the peace process with the Palestinians, I think the Palestinians share some blame, particularly Arafat. And of course, the fact that we didn't have a breakthrough with Syria can be explained in a number of ways, and there are a number of people who are very happy that we didn't at the time because they don't think that peace would hold under the present circumstances. And we come to the current situation. Since the Arab revolutions began, and given the dominance of the Islamist track or trend in the Arab revolutions, given the takeover of Egypt by the democratic takeover of Egypt by the Muslim Brotherhood, given the Hamas takeover of Gaza, and by the way, Hamas, with some justice, I think, sees itself as the precursor of the Arab revolutions. They won a democratic election in 2006. In 2006. But Israel looks around and it sees Islamists who don't basically recognize it. Yes, Egypt acquiesces in the peace agreement and allows the army to dialogue with us, but it has virtually, at the government-to-government level, is almost nothing going on. Hamas refuses to talk to us. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, the most veteran of the Islamists on our borders with heavy Iranian influence, refuses to talk to us. Syria, nobody knows what's going to happen, but the Islamist element or the Salafist element, these elements are among the strongest in the opposition, are going to be playing a role whatever happens. And as we look at our border, our Golan border, we already see not Islamists but Salafists on the other side of the border, and this is a cause of great concern. Jordan has certainly undergone some destabilization, has managed to hold, but there's a strong Muslim Brotherhood element there as well that concerns us. And so the overall picture looking around is one of growing Islamist influence, which exacerbates and will exacerbate the isolation, the regional isolation that we're in anyway, partly thanks to our own mistakes with regard to the Palestinians. Now, it's a mixed bag. The picture is not nearly as clear-cut as it was back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, because we do still have relations with Jordan and Egypt, and there are different kind of Islamists, and it's possible we'll have some closer ties with the Egyptians. The Netanyahu government is actually more inclined than the Israeli left to dialogue even indirectly with Hamas, because you have two parties, neither of which wants a two-state solution. So on this negative basis, they can find aspects of coexistence, economic and other, to talk about, and the Egyptians are particularly interested in helping out here. But going beyond our Arab neighbors, we have Iran since '79, Islamist, and we have Turkey under Erdogan, which, at least until the recent apology over the Mavi Marmara, would have to be classified among hostile Islamist neighbors, and there's a huge question mark as to where this way may be going. So what emerges from here? What emerges in the thinking of Israeli strategic planners in the Prime Minister's office and in the Foreign Ministry is some kind of notion of a new periphery. It's not called a new periphery. Well, it is, but not officially. I mean, officially it's called spheres of containment, or a shatot. Rafi, where's Rafi? Azorli, shatot.
Bows,
huh?
Bows?
Not bows, no, you're rusty. Arcs. And it very tentatively looks like this. Azerbaijan to the north of Iran. If you go back 10, 15 years, just a few years after Azerbaijani independence from the Soviet Union, the Turks were involved here. There was even talk then of a northern triangle that would parallel the old Turkey, Iran, Israel triangle. Azerbaijan, very close intelligence relationship. We sell arms, we buy oil, and we're sitting to Iran's north in the same way that, let's say, we could telegraph the Egyptians back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we're sitting to your south. And we're sitting amidst Azeris, and the Azeri issue is at least a sensitive one from the Iranian standpoint. Moving to Turkey, the containment of Turkey, if you like, you have a very spectacular new relationship with Cyprus and Greece. which is based initially on shared fears of Islam and Turkey. It now includes a very important commercial element, the natural gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, is complicated since the apology by the speculation that the Turks will want to import that gas. And the simplest way to export the gas, to monetize the gas, is to lay a pipeline to Turkey. All the other solutions are extremely complex, but it's simply a huge question mark as to what extent the thaw with Turkey is going to affect any of this. The president of Cyprus, the newly elected president of Cyprus, the bankrupt president of Cyprus, coming to Israel next week, and this is a very clear indication of concern and the need to coordinate in the aftermath of the apology. And moving still around Turkey, you have since Mavi Marmara in particular, you have much closer intelligence and other relations with and military relations with Bulgaria and Romania. If you want an illustration, Google Mayor Dagan, Prime Minister of Bulgaria, and you will see something quite extraordinary. A few months after the Mavi Marmara incident, the head of the Mossad has a photo op with the Prime Minister of Bulgaria. Now, to the best of my knowledge and memory, heads of Mossad never had photo ops. Even since their name is known, they don't have photo ops with foreign leaders. And this was clear, a very clear signal to the Turks, we're on your rear as well. Not that I think Turkey need take any of this seriously, because the Turks know perfectly well that you add up Romania, Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Greece, the latter two dead broke, you don't get much of a threat or a containment. But that's what it is. And moving south, again, Ethiopia, Kenya. Here there's significance with regard to interdicting weapons smuggling by Iran and Hezbollah via the Red Sea into Sudan. And you have South Sudan again. And you have already the Egyptians complaining. The Nile, the Nile, the Nile. Now, it's the Chinese who are building a big dam on the Blue Nile in Ethiopia. The Blue Nile supplies 80 to 85% of the waters of the Nile that reach Egypt, not Israel. But that doesn't stop the Egyptian paranoia about this. Okay, and moving on to the east, the Emirates, where even despite the breaking of those low-level relations that we saw in the mid-90s, there certainly has developed a fairly strong commercial relationship and some other clandestine aspects as well, against the backdrop of the shared perception of a threat from Iran. If you want to see the one present-day manifestation of this, I think you have to recognize that Secretary of State Kerry is interested in the Arab Peace Initiative, not just because he thinks it's a good idea, but there are also people around Netanyahu who are saying, if the Arab Peace Initiative can give us some kind of security relationship with the Gulf, putting the Israeli-Palestinian peace process in a broader regional framework, then it has to mean security, and it has to mean toward the Gulf. And if this could happen, then it might be easier for Netanyahu to make some concessions. I wouldn't put too much stock in this, but it's just an interesting speculation, and I think it does explain why Kerry has not yet at least been told point blank, drop this issue. It's a total non-starter from our standpoint. To summarize, beginning with the old periphery, it had its successes, it had its failures. There is a school of thought in Israel that argues that at that time, because we were so interested in the periphery, we ignored peace possibilities with our neighbors, going back to the 50s and 60s, that it was a zero-sum game. I don't buy this, quite frankly. There was always controversy in Israel, let's say, between the Ben Gurion school and the Sharet school as to whether the Arabs are offering any serious options for peace and whether we're doing enough about them. And the periphery clearly fits very much into here. My own sense as a former practitioner of the Periphery Doctrine is that it did not hurt prospects for peace. Here and there even contributed to them simply by showing our neighbors that we're not alone. Now, 2013, again, a sense of growing isolation, a very different Israel, not a tiny, isolated, weak country, but an economic powerhouse, 8 million people, a medium-sized country with excellent economic, commercial relations, even military relations all over the world. And so there's no isolation equivalent to what you had in the past. There are those who are trying to build up this new Periphery Doctrine, who see it again as a kind of zero-sum game. That is to say, we'll never get anywhere with our neighbors. No chance for a two-state solution on terms we can accept. Our neighbors are becoming more extreme. They're becoming Islamist. We have to build up these spheres of containment around them. And if you want a comic illustration of this, it was mentioned, I think, by Tom Friedman in his column a few months ago. You had one wag in Israel who said, let's take our put our high-tech experts to work, how to detach Israel from the Asian mainland and float it to Europe. Now, I mean, there is in this a statement that that's the way a lot of Israelis would like to see themselves. I've always wanted to see themselves. It certainly fits the stereotype of how the Arabs think we want to see ourselves. And if we act it out by completely turning our backs, this can be, in some ways, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think the challenges of this new periphery are to learn from the old how to make this a win-win, potential win-win proposition, or at least avoid making it a zero-sum game. The connections on the periphery don't have to come at the expense of exploiting whatever inroads there are, whatever possibilities, however minor, to improve our coexistence with our neighbors, including Islamist neighbors, whether it's Hamas or the Egyptians, and perhaps the best case in point is Turkey, and perhaps the best test is Turkey. Because the question is, can we recultivate some kind of strategic relationship with Turkey, not at the expense of Cyprus and Greece? Now that requires mature diplomatic behavior, which we have not always been good at. But this is certainly a test of whether we can basically walk and chew gum at the same time when it comes to dealing with our neighbors. A penultimate point, can we leverage the new periphery into a positive influence with our neighbors? And here the best case in point again is Egypt and the Nile. Egyptians are paranoid about our presence near the sources of the Nile. And they're going to invent 101 different plots that we're involved in, and so on and so forth. You can read it not only in the yellow press, you can hear it from very, very serious, mainstream, non-Islamist Egyptians. How do we leverage this into positive influence in order to increase our desirability, the desirability of having contact with us in the eyes of the Egyptian brethren who are running the country? And finally, it's very tempting for those who are planning and engineering this new periphery idea to see it as a way of cutting ourselves off from the Asian mainland and floating off to Europe and turning our backs completely on the Palestinian issue or on whatever happens afterward in Syria. It's not going to work. And this must not come at the expense of a serious and concerted effort toward a two-state solution, even if our neighbors are all Islamists, because this is the only way we're going to keep the Israel we want, a Jewish and a democratic state. So I think I'll rest my case here. Welcome your questions and comments.
That was fascinating. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A. Please disclose your identity when you ask a question. Barbara.
Can I just talk? I don't have to wait for a mic.
I think we have a mic coming.
Just talk. No, it's okay. Forget mine.
I'm taking it one by one.
Yeah. If that's all right with you.
That's best. I told you about my memory. I have a great memory, but it's very short.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you. I know your voice better than I know your face, since you were producing many sound bites for me in my days as a
No,
diplomatic
but we last met on the eve of Camp David 2000 in the Israel Embassy in Washington.
Well, that's
Your memory isn't so short.
Your memory isn't so
Right.
short.
Spoken from that Barbara.
But anyway, thank you. I'm now with the Atlantic Council, I'm a think tanker, and I'm going to take you out of the periphery and back to your neighbors, if I may. What is the evolving Israeli position on Syria? Is Israel happy to see Arabs kill Arabs, as many are saying, and Syria essentially crippled as a conventional threat to Israel? Do you see this as a benefit in terms of the confrontation with Iran? What more do you think the U.S. should do, or do you think Obama's playing just about right?
Okay.
It's a yes or no question.
This is look. If we classify the perception of a growing nuclear threat from Iran as the most important security issue, we have to classify Syria as the most urgent security issue. Okay, it doesn't have the existential impact of Iran, but in terms of urgency, our security establishment is increasingly seriously preoccupied with this issue. Now, the Israeli position began with saying, going back 2 years and some, with saying, the Assads kept a quiet border for 40 years. That's not something to laugh at. Who knows who's going to take over? In any case, we're not going to get involved, and we've never gotten involved, with exception of one airstrike, and we've set up a little hospital on the Golan, and we're taking care of any wounded Syrian who shows up at the border and asks for treatment is taken care of and immediately whisked back, and nobody is told which side he belongs to. Okay, but that's the limit. That's the limit, and that began when this all got. But okay, in terms of sentiment, the initial sense was better the devil you know. As with the passage of time, let's say sometime within the first year, the assessment was Assad's going to fall. We don't know when, we don't know how, but it's going to fall. Let's look at the benefits. Well, the biggest benefit is that if this pushes Iran out of the Levant, if it pushes it out of Syria, it cuts it off from Hezbollah, this is a huge blow to Iran's strategic designs. It could even have a positive effect on Iran as a nuclear enemy, a future enemy as well. So let's look at the silver lining, and that's getting rid of Iran. And that's where we've been since then. But again, very wisely, and you have to give Netanyahu and Barak earlier and now Ya'alon credit for avoiding any involvement. Now I'm jumping to the Periphery Doctrine, because when you talk to Syrians and Lebanese, they almost about these events, they almost universally say, well, you Israelis are on the side of the minorities. You always have been. You even heard statements like, I was asked this by a prominent Syrian revolutionary, when Assad falls, you're going to help the Alawites, right? You can even hear from some Syrians that I'm trying to remember how it goes, we helped Assad the father take power in return for the Golan. I mean, you can all these stories which boil down to Israel as a friend of the minorities, not of the mainstream Sunni majority. So that's the broad picture. Now, there is huge concern of two military aspects of the deterioration of the situation in Syria. One is chemical weapons and missiles, whether missile delivery systems or missiles, falling into the wrong hands. It's true, Assad himself more than once publicly said, if I fall, I'm going to take the Israelis with me and fire missiles at them. This is the Samson scenario, if you like. It's not given a lot of credibility because either he's dead already and he can't push the button, or if he hasn't pushed the button, why invite Israel to deliver the coup de grace in anger in return? It doesn't make much sense, but you never know. But the real concern is that all this stuff falls into the wrong hands. And here, the latest high point of this was Itai Brun, the head of assessment in the military intelligence, stating last week that they're using chemical weapons. And in effect, sending a challenge to the United States. You said this was a game changer. And it's interesting, the US and the world took this much more seriously than when the British and the French just before that said the same thing. For all I know, Brun is citing the British evidence. That's the story. The Brits showed it to the Jordanians, they showed it to us. By the way, this has moved us closer to Jordan, to the Hashemite kingdom at the strategic level in a quite extraordinary way, because the king has agreed to meet with Bibi twice in recent months to talk about this. I would say this is a very, very serious concern. This is on one level. The second level is terrorism, cross-border terrorism, spearheaded by Salafists who are already setting up shop in the villages on the Syrian side of the Golan. And with Assad withdrawing army units for the defense of Damascus and abandoning this area to them. I would add one other, again, returning to the periphery, which as you can see, Barbara, is my true love here. I would add one other interesting point, and as I said earlier, that after the fiasco with the Maronites, we really have had very little to do with minorities. And the main, I mean, Syria is full of minorities, essentially Levant minorities. The one possible exception here is, and even assuming that the war spreads to Lebanon, which in some ways it already is not the Maronites, because I don't think we'll have any truck with the Maronites anymore, but it's the Druze. The Druze of Jabal Druze, who are Jabal Druze, which is located 75 kilometers east of the Golan near the Syria-Jordan border, and who have managed to stay out of this to a large extent until now, to stay neutral, with exceptions on both sides, but who are increasingly concerned that the Salafism is going to attack them, because in the eyes of Salafists, they're heretics, no more and no less than we are. There may be a cry for help from there at some point. And here you have to realize there is a serious Druze lobby in Israel. There are...
How many Druze are there in Israel?
Less than 2% of the population, I don't have the figure, but 100,000 and something. And they have, their representation in the Knesset is twice their percentage in the population, spread across the Zionist parties, and several high-ranking officers in the army. So, and here too, if you go back 100 years and trace this all the way from then, relations between us and the Druze of Lebanon and Syria, discussion of setting up a Druze buffer state. In the 50s and 60s, there were actually IDF Druze units trained to intervene in Jabal Druze. Next war, never happened. After 67, Yigal Allon, Deputy Prime Minister, writes to Eshkol and says, this is our opportunity. We've got the units. Let's go to Jabal Druze. The Jordanians will love it. He decided. All this, nothing ever happened. But, and if those of you who know Walid Junbalat know that you can't exactly consider him a reliable long-term partner in any direction whatsoever. But I'm just saying, keep this in mind, because it could in some way come back on the agenda. I would just underline one point in closing this answer, Barbara, and that is that if you, looking at it from the standpoint of an Israeli, and I'm not talking here about Israeli extremists who look for holocausts everywhere and so on and so forth. I'm talking about very solid people. Itai Brun, Amos Yadlin, both spoke out last week. Very, very solid people. You take North Korea, you take the chemical weapons in Syria, and you take the Iran issue, and there is a growing sense in Israel that we may indeed have to take things into our own hands.
Well, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Sir.
Gareth Porter, Interpress Service. Good to see you again, Yossi. I want to ask you to go back to a period that you sort of skipped over, which is the status of the Periphery Doctrine in the 90s, specifically under Rabin, and even more, I'd be interested in your observations about the early period of the first Netanyahu administration, 96, 97. 98. In terms of, as I'm sure you know, there's a literature out there, including Rand Corporation's study about Israel and Iran, which suggests, based on interviews with unidentified sources, that the Periphery Doctrine was still very much alive and well during that period, that there was a feeling that, residual feeling, if you will, that Iran was still more concerned about its Arab neighbors than it was about Israel, and that there was still a possibility for improvement of relations in some fashion. And I'd be interested in your observations about that period.
Okay, I put this under a chapter entitled Periphery Nostalgia. And in my view, it's baseless. But yes, there have been and still are all kinds of Israelis who look upon the Islamist regime in Tehran as this unnatural aberration. These aren't the real Iranians. One prominent planner saying, just give me $100 million for satellite TV broadcasts and I'll bring them down. Another telling me, if and when we do end up attacking Iran, its nuclear project, this will bring down this artificial regime. The good guys will come back to power. Iran-Contra from the Israeli standpoint, not so much the American standpoint, from the Israeli standpoint was an example. And so some people never learn. I think it's important to note, at the official planning echelon, I don't see this nostalgia at work, but among certain individuals, it's there, and Iran-Contra was very much mainstream from the standpoint of, well, it was not mainstream because it also bypassed the Israeli intelligence establishment just as it did the American intelligence. So there is that point of view. You can see it vis-a-vis Erdogan and Turkey as well. Erdogan's an aberration. These aren't the real Turks. We'll get beyond this. So just as, and these are the people who are traditionally, and many of them go back to the 70s, more sentimental about the periphery relationship. That is, there was more to these relationships than realpolitik, which I mentioned the Kurds and the Southern Sudanese. I haven't found any sentimentality anywhere on the periphery other than that, and I'm not sure about that side. If you want the most horrific example is the Maronites, who were totally cynical about what they were doing with us, and they told plenty of people about it too, and you had a controversy in Israel, but the majority who believed in them won out. So again, this is a matter of maturity. How mature we are as diplomats, even as clandestine diplomats. But I think that answers your question.
But just to be clear,
Hey, let's actually give other people a chance for a question. I think that was actually a pretty good answer to that. And we have somebody from RAND here who could deal with the RAND issue. Just kidding, Mike. Sir.
Greg Goldman from Council on Foreign Relations. I was wondering if you could address the issue of Israel's perception of the threat from weapons of mass destruction in the context of the Periphery Doctrine. Initial threats to Israel were from the neighboring Arab states, right? Egypt in the 60s, Iraq in the 70s, but later the threat migrated to Pakistan and Iran in terms of nuclear threats. So I'm just curious, how did the to what extent did Israel use the Periphery Doctrine to address proliferation threats to its security?
Look, the Periphery Doctrine, which I describe as a grand strategy, came, roughly speaking, came into existence along with, in parallel with three other grand strategies, and David Ben-Gurion gets a great deal of credit for his vision in the mid-50s. One I mentioned is a great power or superpower ally. We need a really, really powerful friend, and we have to bend over backwards to keep that friend. It was Britain and France in the mid-50s. After 67, it became the United States. A second was, I mentioned, also mass ingathering of the exiles. I mean, you're looking at a country that within 5 or 6 years had quadrupled its demographic size in a Herculean effort to give it critical mass. And a third was possessing a nuclear deterrent. All of these grand strategies came into existence at the same time, but there's almost no connection between the periphery. There had a connection with the ingathering of the exiles and the great power strategy, not very much with the nuclear strategy, to my mind. I mean, you can find a few points, for example, as in the Shah's last year, or last year and a half, before it registered what was going on, you have Minister of Defense Ezra Weizmann going to Tehran to sell him missile technology and ignoring the fact that he already had a nuclear program and was buying the uranium from South Africa. Quite an adventurous approach, I would say. You mentioned Pakistan, which can be included in some vision of the periphery or not, but bear in mind that the Pakistanis did a very smart thing early on in their nuclear project, and that is to send us a very clear message. This is not about you. This is about India. And when did you ever hear Israel complain about the Pakistani nuclear program? Now, we may yet rue the day we didn't, if those nuclear weapons fall into the wrong hands. But the fact is, we never complained. There's a limit how much we can complain about. If Iran sent us the same message, I believe it would have made a huge difference. I mean, one of the aspects of the Iranian nuclear program that's generally ignored in the international efforts to deal with it is their repeated threats to destroy us. Well, Pakistan doesn't threaten to destroy us. Pakistan made it very clear that they couldn't care less about us. And Iran does everything possible to put itself in the center of get its center of our attention as a party that threatens to use these weapons. And that's I don't say it's all the difference, but it's a not inconsiderable part of the difference.
All the way in the back.
My name is Warren Clark. I'm from Churches of Middle East Peace. You mentioned in passing that both Hamas and the current government of Israel don't have much interest in the two-state solution. And I was wondering if you could explore that just for a minute. That is, I can understand there are irredentist settlers and so forth who look on the West Bank as that should be always a part of the land of Israel. But certainly the idea of the one-state solution seems to be anathema to many people. Any other things, it's not one state or two state, looks very bad. Why is there not more interest in the two-state solution or some accommodation with the Palestinians?
Look, well, all right, we don't have another hour.
No, we have 7 minutes.
There are embodied in your question a number of different aspects. I mean, why is the Netanyahu government more prepared to dialogue indirectly with Hamas is one, and another is why are Israelis turned off, not by the two-state solution, but by the possibility of actually affecting a two-state solution. There's a big difference, because the majority of Israelis still want a two-state solution. Netanyahu just yesterday, or the day before, said we need a Palestinian state so that Israel can remain a Jewish and a democratic state. The bigger question is, why are we so demoralized, including on the Israeli left, which, note that the Israeli Zionist left that actively promotes a two-state solution at the top of their agenda got only 10% of the vote, 10% of the Knesset in the last election. Okay? So why are so many people demoralized and turned off about this? There's a long list of reasons, and I'm going to leave it for some other time because otherwise maybe somebody else wants to ask about the periphery. It can go on forever.
Okay, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. David Schoenbaum, I represent nobody in particular, but me. I would like to ask about the
mic.
impact
Sir, the
of
mic.
changing demography
Professor, Mike?
and domestic politics on foreign policy.
Say again.
I'd like to ask about the impact, short, middle, long term, as you wish, of changing demography and domestic politics on foreign policy.
In Israel.
Yes.
Got another hour?
There are.
I don't know, but which periphery does this concern?
The domestic periphery.
The domestic
is no
periphery.
longer the periphery.
The outer edges of
No, there is a
Israel.
periphery in Israel, and it is a demographic periphery, and it's the developing towns in the south and the north, where you settled immigrant populations over the decades, and that's always there's plenty to talk
Well, I was
about.
thinking sociological
Hmm?
periphery. I was thinking sociological periphery.
First of all, it's not my field of expertise. No, seriously. There are plenty of experts who can, I think, address this issue much better. Let me just offer this. The percentage of the Israeli Jewish, well, the percentage of Israeli public that is Arab is growing, high birth rate. The percentage of the Israeli public that is ultra-Orthodox is growing, high birth rate. Secular Jews have only themselves to blame because they've been paying these people to have babies, and still are. But these two populations are not always peripheral geographically, although the Arabs generally are, but are peripheral in Israeli politics, because the Arabs have never taken part in a coalition, and the ultra-Orthodox take part in any coalition as long as it pays them to develop their institutions. They'll vote any way you want on peace and whatever. If you're looking for a dynamic element in Israeli society that does affect politics, without growing in any significant numbers, it's the national Orthodox. All right, I'm talking about the knitted kippot as compared to the black kippot of the ultra-Orthodox. The national Orthodox who spearhead the secular movement and are without a doubt the most dynamic element, playing by the democratic rules, but the most dynamic element in Israeli society. They have spearheaded the settlement movement, and they have manipulated their influence so that governments of the left and of the right let them keep expanding. Right now, for the last 4.5 years, they have a government which wants them to expand, so it's even easier. And Netanyahu's second government, which ended a few months ago, was without a doubt a secular government, and this one even more so. Yes, there's Tzipi Livni as a fig leaf. She's here in Washington now. Because Netanyahu sensed that there's going to be more pressure now for some kind of a peace process, and that even the public wants to see it. But this is the government is totally oriented toward expanding the settlements. And they've done it, you can't say they've done it unfairly. If they've broken rules, we've let them break the rules. And this goes all the way back to 67, or more specifically 75, 76, when the first Israeli politicians who opened the gates were people like Shimon Peres, the great champion of peace today. Now, is it impossible for a constellation to evolve in which there's a government that's prepared to do a two-state solution? It's not impossible. It's still possible. International pressure could be one factor. Some catastrophic event could be another factor. Change in public perceptions could be another. But to tell you I'm optimistic, no. And but here you have to, I gave you just one side of the story. The Palestinians made their own contribution to make sure that a Palestinian state didn't evolve. Yasser Arafat was dedicated to terrorism and corruption. And Mahmoud Abbas knows what borders he wants, but he's not prepared to compromise on the question of who owns the Temple Mount. He's not prepared to compromise on the question of that Israel has to embrace the right of return and acknowledge that it was born in sin. And under these circumstances, and again, this is a different issue, we're not going to get very far. That's my own assessment. I wish Secretary Kerry all the luck in the world and all the success in the world, but I'm not optimistic.
We have time for one more very crisp, very succinct question relating to the topic at hand, that is the Periphery Doctrine. Is there anybody who has a question that meets those criteria?
I swear I'm not pulling your leg. Gabe Scheinman, Georgetown University. I was wondering if you could just talk about the impact the dissolution of the Soviet Union had on Israel's periphery strategy, which opened up a lot of possibilities, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Europe or the Caucasus, Central Asia, etc.
Okay, first of all, I mean,
Was I fair? Did I
no,
follow?
very fair. I mean, this event comes after the demise of the original periphery. Essentially, there's still a good relationship with Turkey and with Ethiopia, but there is, I mean, it parallels the first Iraq War, the emergence of the Madrid process, the Oslo breakthrough, and very much a concentration on the core and not the periphery. Now, it does open the Asian periphery, that is the stands. I mentioned Azerbaijan, but there are some who would point to additional Central Asian, Turkic-speaking countries as a periphery of sorts, even though you're really geographically going pretty far afield, and particularly with the cooling off of relations with Turkey, this has become that much more difficult. I'm not aware of any significant changes in Africa, that is in our relations with the African periphery I'm referring to as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, if you go back to the Soviet days, and now I'm talking about the new periphery, if you look at a country like Cyprus, from the time of Makarios and independence on, was very much third world, non-aligned, and pro-Arab. And Greece, to a considerable extent, Greece was the last European country to have full diplomatic relations with Israel, only in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union. So this is the beginning of evolution in their policies, away from the pro-Soviet bloc, if you like, the Arab bloc, and toward a more balanced policy toward Israel, which I think many Arabs today would say is unbalanced in the other direction, because they've really become pretty strong friends of Israel, looking to rely on it from particularly from a security standpoint when it comes to their worries about Turkey. But you've given me food for thought. I'll have to think about that a little more. I know I've talked to Russian scholars of the Middle East who are very aware, much more than their counterparts here or in Europe. They're very aware of the periphery policy, and they followed it very closely. I can just tell you one anecdote. In 70, 71, I was, among other things, preparing propaganda material for the Anyanya, the South Sudanese underground that was fighting the Numeri regime, and we made this look very African, these pamphlets and stuff, and spread it all over Africa. And at one point, our ambassador in Addis sends a cable. He says, I was at a cocktail, and a Russian diplomat, Soviet diplomat, this is back in the late 60s, early 70s, comes up to me with one of these pamphlets and hands it to me and says, nice job.
Very good, very, very good. Well, on that note, you've given us a lot of food for thought, and for that we're grateful, so thank you very much.